Naturalized very recently, in fact. But many of you know me as Dallas Johnson. I'm CEO, co-founder of Credify, and we've been working on some pretty interesting stuff in the blockchain space. And today, the title's a bit different from what was presented in the Meetup outline, but it actually covers the same information, just kind of in a more roundabout way. So I'm going to assume that, given that this is a FinTech meeting, that there are individuals here who might not have exposure to blockchain yet. So you might not understand sort of the fundamentals of what blockchain is. And this is kind of important for me to discuss a little bit, and I'm not going to go in too much depth, just to give you enough information to support sort of what we're looking to cover in the presentation. So, at its simplest form, what a blockchain is, it's a decentralized, immutable record of state, right? So what does that mean, a record of state? So when we talk about state in sort of software systems, or when we talk about state in records that may exist within certain government registries, we talk about a lot of it has to do with sort of transition, right? So it's from one thing to the next. So when we talk about records of state, we talk about having something being represented in a digital form, and that something is being changed. And we have to have a mechanism, essentially, of determining how this thing can be changed in a decentralized manner. So what that means is that I have some information, you have some information, and we both want to have the same information. And if we want to change that information, then we have to agree to that. But we can't trust the protocol that we use for changing that in that sense. We can't trust that I'm communicating through this and that there isn't an adversary looking to modify my change of state to represent that to you, for example. And so what that means is that, or at the sort of basis of this, a lot of existing systems, we talk about these records of state, and this is where this concept of ledger comes from. So the ledger is literally just transactions that are listed in the traditional sense, right? We list transactions. So from A to B as something has been sent. So that's a state change, right? That means I have something, and I'm sending it to you. So the state of me having it is being represented in one point of time, and then when I transfer that to you, then in the next point of that state transition, you have that now, and I don't, right? So this is very, very basic concept of what blockchain means. And actually, this happens to be a really big deal, because there are so many things that we do on a daily basis. There are so many systems that we interact with that depend upon a state, right? So for example, let's take healthcare, right? You personally have a record of healthcare because as you live your life, your health changes, essentially. As we get older, our eyesight gets weaker, we may get higher blood pressure or things like this. So essentially, the state of our being is being recorded in these systems in the healthcare industry, right? But the problem with this is that these sort of bits of information are all siloed, right? So especially like in Japan, because it just tends to be living in the dark ages with regards to sort of information for these systems. It's a reality, right? And actually, it's not just Japan. There are many, many other countries in the world that the healthcare system is still very outdated. But you can think now that, let's say that you've been visiting, one hospital because it's been close to your house. You have a general practitioner that checks your health all the time, and he keeps sort of a log of your current state of health. Now, what happens when you move is that you have to go get a copy of all of those logs and take that over to the new hospital and present that to him. And there are protocols that exist for me, essentially they're very basic arcane protocols that exist for me to, for example, if I've taken this envelope of my information and somehow modified the information inside that envelope, for let's say if I was trying to get insurance, right? If I'm trying to get life insurance, if I've had a history of cancer or heart disease, they're not going to give me insurance in Japan. Now, what if I have taken these records and there is a record, or if there's some state in there that is representing my health condition, and then I modify that in the transition, right? That could be problematic. So, indeed, there are many, many industries in the world that depend upon state transition and integrity in that transition of state. And this is what blockchain enables at its core. It enables us essentially to achieve transition of state in a decentralized way without having to trust in the mechanism of that transition. And so, sort of given that presentation saying that, look, there are lots of different places where we could say that blockchain has applications. But in reality, and we're all sort of familiar with the hype. I mean, blockchain has been hyped to just, no end in the media. There were days when you could turn on any type of financial news or media and it was talking about Bitcoin. Bitcoin's at $17,000, And this was a time when everyone was asking, whoa, what is this Bitcoin thing? What is this thing? What is this? Why are people going crazy over this stuff? Well, the reason people are going crazy over it is because of this, right? I mean, this is the foundational reason why we're going crazy over this, because there is a potential for significant disruption. Just like with the internet. When the internet first came out, we talk about the internet as being sort of like a network of information, right? So when the internet came out, everyone was very hyped up on it, right? Especially, 1995 to 2000, when we saw NASDAQ go up to, several $1 trillion actually in market value, right? So why does that happen? So essentially, people look at sort of this craze that's associated with the pricing of things, and then forget to think about the actual value of that. I mean, where is that value being derived from, right? And so right now, I ask this question to a lot of audiences. I ask for you to point out to me where you think on the technological adoption curve we are with regards to blockchain. Can anyone raise your hand if you'd like to? Where do you think we are?
Still fairly in the front.
Fairly in the front, so like more innovator side?
I'm going to say for at least the area of software development in the late majority.
Late majority in software
Blockchain
development
is
purposes.
core to most SCM systems right now.
Okay, that's cool. So then I would ask, based upon that assumption, how many people are using blockchain daily? Daily. You're using it daily.
Does anybody here use Git? If so, you're using blockchain daily.
Well, Git certainly is using a Merkle tree-based representation of state. That's true. But what I mean about blockchain is a decentralized Merkle
Is
representation
Git not
of state.
decentralized?
Well, it is, but it's based upon a central repository.
Is it?
Yeah.
So if I fork my repo and go off in this way, if I fork this open source software project and I have a different repo and I put mine on GitLab instead of GitHub, but the one on GitHub keeps going.
Right, but the difference
Still-
is that the change that is made in GitHub is not necessarily reflected in GitLab at that point. So you would fork something on GitHub, you would push that over to GitLab, and then start building off of that your own forks and merging back in. But then when you're looking back at GitHub, and then you develop off on another branch there and start merging those back in, then at that time they're not being reflected. Now you could do merges between the two if needed.
Right.
But I'm just emphasizing that with regards to what we're considering sort of the adoption of blockchain or the mechanism of blockchain, I'm talking about this sort of trustless system of state transition. And with particular sort of applications in finance or in asset transference or things like this. So that's kind of more what I'm focusing. But you're right. I mean, it is a Merkle tree. There is an aspect to it that is very similar to. It's essentially it's a blockchain without a consensus mechanism, really.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
It's on whoever decides this is my master branch for this version of the software. That's their consensus. And some people will say, will fork and say, just like we start with Bitcoin, and then we have Bitcoin Cash. Sometimes projects will get forked. And now there's two consensi, something like that. And so that forks exactly like with our software projects.
Yeah, I think
And
there's a
maybe
good,
this one
good
does
parallel.
better, it doesn't do worse.
Certainly, there's a good parallel there. And someone else, where do you think we are in this adoption?
How would you measure it? Like one product that millions of people use,
Yeah.
but millions of people using basically everything with blockchain because that's where we head right to.
Right. Okay, so the concept here of essentially when we talk about the early majority, okay, so the difference between early adopters and early majority, does anyone know what that is? So early adopters are essentially adopting the technology because they believe it's revolutionary. They believe it's something that's going to change the future. Whereas the early majority are adopting technology because it's something that is evolutionary. It's something that's providing them a change that will actually provide utility in their life and therefore improve it or improve some system. So we currently are not in the early majority, I would say. I would have to say that. Some argue, in fact, that we're still kind of in an innovator stage. I don't believe that because we have far more sort of exposure to the press with regards to technology. But I would say that definitely we are heading towards that chasm. And I think that we've started to feel the chasm, in fact, with the pullback in the markets. Because that's when everyone's like, oh, this is just hype. It's all a fad. You know, and so many people are just abandoning it. You hear like redemptions and funds that had been invested and made a whole lot of money in 2017, but then lost a ton of money in 2018, for example. So sentiment is sort of driving this perception, yeah. But in reality, what is required for us to make that transition, right? And so what I say is sort of, in order to win the early majority, we must address real-world pain points, first and foremost, right? Because there are a lot of people who are actually, they have ideas about how to apply blockchain to problems that have already been solved by centralized solutions quite well, in fact. And I think that because they're kind of chasing the dragon, as it were, they're wanting to develop these decentralized solutions because they thought, oh, well, if I do this and I create a token, then I can go make a whole lot of money, and then we moon and we get our Lambos. And so there was a lot of crap, essentially, that was developed on top of these systems that really did not depend upon the fundamentals of blockchain. So that's why I say that there has to be a proper justification for decentralization goals, right? And then also, we need to be able to provide like easy, intuitive engagements with these systems, because right now they're quite complex, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And then also achieving sort of frictionless on and offboarding, and this is more focused sort of like on the transactions, the transaction of value concept of blockchain adoption. And then I say this idea of sort of glue all the things. And the concept here is that right now, even in the blockchain, right, especially in the blockchain space, in the current state, it's very fragmented. And that fragmentation, actually, I think, is a huge barrier to adoption. Because people are confused as fuck when they look, and they're like, what are these things? So I kind of go into that later. So I say one of the highest hurdles with regards to blockchain is usability. Now, I've been part of a technology company that developed a technology that was very, very cutting edge at the time. When I joined, we were early stage, and this is a technology that users, have a very real interaction with. And so it's biometric technology that you now know as Touch ID. So when we were developing this technology, we had to face this hurdle of usability, right? We had to think, okay, so there's a trade-off with security and with convenience. And there's this beautiful thing called a ROC curve, a receiver operator curve, that essentially, you graph these two things and find the sweet spot in the middle. where you hit it. You say, okay, this is how much security we need to get to this level of convenience, and therefore it works from a user's perspective. Because I don't know if you guys are familiar with earlier biometric systems. When you went in and tried to swipe your finger or whatever, many times it would fail, right? But how many of you have iPhones? Do you use Touch ID or Face ID now? That's right. Yeah. Well, before Face ID, Touch ID. I mean, but you don't get a lot of failures with the system, right? It's pretty accurate. It's really good. And in fact, it's very difficult to hack the system as well. So the security is extremely high as well, right? So we managed to make something that was usable for something that seemed very difficult to get adoption for, right? Because people are, when they think, biometrics, my personal data, right? Oh my God, what am I going to do? My fingerprint, all these. So people freak out about this. But in reality, now this stuff is being used by billions of people around the world, right? So how do we do that with blockchain, right? Well, we're not going to do it like this. This is like, what the fuck? And it's literally, what is it? I mean, if you try to engage with a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, this is what you face. Or do you know what a gas limit is? You will. You okay? Anyone else know what a gas limit is? Okay, well, good. It's good. Educated crowd. So, essentially, gas limit is specifying how much Ethereum you're going to let a smart contract burn before the transaction is abandoned. Did you just understand that? Okay. See, still, the only people that understand it are the only people who've been using gas limits, right? But let me tell you. So, this is an issue. It's a big issue because the average person is not going to interface to this system this way. It's not going to work. Now, this is a way to do it very securely in the sense that you can interface to a hardware wallet. You can authenticate, or you can essentially allow a transaction to happen through authentication on your device or whatever to enable this transaction. But that whole process is just way too just complex for the average person. So it's a problem. And I'd even say that there are bigger problems, to be honest. So we're facing regulatory uncertainty in many jurisdictions around the world, right? So we all want to adopt this technology. We all want to take this to the next stage. We all want to get people to be able to come into the system and to be able to engage with these things. But one of the hurdles, one of the biggest hurdles, is regulatory uncertainty. Because if I go and I take my hard-earned capital and I start investing in a startup that's developing these new technologies on blockchain or even the blockchain protocols itself, I have no guarantee that later on that can be adopted because of the regulatory uncertainty. There's no way I can guarantee that I'll get a return on my investment in this basis. Now, you could argue, okay, well, if it's a truly decentralized system, then it's working outside of the legal system. I don't buy that. That's not how this world works. There has to be a way for us to interface to this thing without having to worry that we're going to go to jail. That's a problem. And there's another issue, what I say is lack of interoperability. So as I was saying before, there are literally 10s, 20s, 30 different blockchains that sit on market cap tables. And these are low-level protocols. These are actual blockchains themselves. It's not like a derivative token. Now there are a lot of derivative tokens, but Basic, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Stellar, these guys are core blockchains. And they're all different. And they don't interface to each other. Now people are building sort of layer 2 solutions for this, but they're very far out, in all honesty, because you have to sacrifice certain aspects for many of the participants in this system in order to achieve interoperability with regards to the decentralized aspect of it. And then I just kind of, there's like this idea, right, that there's going to be a token for everything. You're going to go into a burger shop and you're going to have a token for the bun and a token for the pickle and a token, that's ridiculous, right? And it really has to do, again, with sort of like these hype phases where everyone's trying to go and create something in this system. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people, of course, have sort of like nefarious intentions. They're intending to go and sort of rip off the public. But there are lots of people who are, developing things with sort of legitimate purposes. But that being said, we're facing what I call token fatigue. Okay, enough angry face. I talk a lot, too much about bad stuff. Let's talk about some good stuff. Okay, so we're heading towards a brighter future, as I would like to say. Not everything is negative. So one glimpse of this future is, essentially okay, so when we're developing these systems to interface into these decentralized ledgers, right, the very first thing that pretty much every DApp faces has to do with users' identity, accounts, right? This sort of forms the basis of interacting with these systems. And one of the beautiful things about blockchain and about decentralized systems in general is that we now have an ability, essentially, to create a decentralized mechanism for identity. And I'll go into sort of like the evolution of this. So we started out in early sort of computing systems with mainframes, right? So you have these centralized servers that you come and interface to through a console, and you had a username and a password, and everyone accessed the same system through all of these disparate terminals, right? And that was a centralized solution to identity. And it was kind of by virtue of the fact that there was everyone didn't have personal computers. Now we are in the sort of next phase of that was a federated system where you have an internet of systems, these disparate systems, and you can use single sign-on for access to each of those systems, right? So this is like using Kerberos or Active Directory technologies. And then we've made this transition of late, very recently in our history, into what they call user-centric, right? So this is in my sense, it's kind of a misnomer in the sense that it gives you sort of like the perception that the user is in control, but it's actually bollocks, right? You don't have control because you don't own the data that sits on Google servers or that sits on Facebook servers. Now there are laws that are being enacted, like in Europe with GDPR, that essentially will kind of they're looking to give users more control over these bits of data that are associated with them, but ultimately it's controlled by a gatekeeper. And then now we're moving into this new stage of evolution in these systems. Essentially, so DIF is the Decentralized Identity Foundation. They're developing a standard for decentralized identity, and that standard is being implemented by the likes of Microsoft, IBM Software, and Civic, and actually we also have been working on this. And so why that's important is because user-centric is not enough, right? In the sense that if all of our data sits on a centralized server provider, we face serious security risks of our data being leaked, of our data being hacked, of our data being sold. For example, Facebook selling our data to Cambridge Analytica. It's a huge scandal, right? Very recently. The Equifax hack is a great example as well, where people's identity put really core information to you, the stuff that you use to go out and get loans for a mortgage, for example. This kind of stuff was leaked, and your identity is completely stolen at that point. So blockchain enables sort of what we call self-sovereignty over your own digital profile. And so this is kind of a very bad simplification of how it actually works, just to kind of help give an idea of what's happening here. But essentially, you can sort of conceptually think about this in the sense that you have a secret that essentially encrypts, you use to encrypt all personal data that is associated with your profile. So whether that be activity online, whether that be personally identifiable information itself, like biometric data, whether that be health records, as I talked before, for your professional history, so the transition of career throughout your life, certificates that you have to prove your education level, and things like this, and also your purchase history, for example, so that we can reference this for creditworthiness. So now that I talked about identity, I would like to talk about trust. And because decentralized, when we face, as we're talking, as he shared, when we talk about sort of like these decentralized systems, we have to have a mechanism of achieving consensus. So we have to have a way of syncing that state amongst all the nodes in the network without having to worry that those nodes have been compromised or that the information that's being transmitted between the nodes has been compromised. So this is where sort of the breakthroughs of the early Bitcoin protocol brought to the market, essentially. And there were earlier works, but Bitcoin is the one that we all sort of know most and has been referenced the most. And essentially, there are many different ways to achieve consensus in these systems, right? And I'll leave it to you to sort of go back. You can study sort of Byzantine general problem, and you can understand why this is difficult, from a computer science perspective. And in addition to sort of all these consensus algorithms, I talk about not just consensus within a system for transmission on a protocol level, but I also talk about sort of consensus on a personal level as humans engaging with these technologies, right? So for example, in a let's say an e-commerce setting, how do I know who you are? Or how do I know that I can trust that you are going to conduct business in a way that will be beneficial to me if I were to engage you for that, right? There's mechanisms now that we use for this, but they're broken. And kind of what I'm going to do here is do a shameless plug. Because I want to show you something that's actually being solved by these technologies. So the problem is, for example, in an e-commerce setting, we have $2.3 trillion of annual e-commerce that's conducted every year online. 84% of consumers depend upon other people's opinions when making purchasing decisions, right? But there's an issue with this because according to research out of MIT and Chicago, anywhere from 20 to 45% of all of that data is fake. And that's affecting, above, or, from $386 billion above.
Try and translate that into something we do every day. Does that mean when I look through a list of 10 Amazon reviews on some particular product
Yes.
I'm thinking about,
Yes.
2 of them are fake?
Yes, that's exactly right. In fact, I have a reference here for Amazon Okay, so what we say is sort of, we're depending more and more upon these, what we call social signals for trust, right? And again, this is that consensus, right? We're trying to reach a consensus amongst each other on a very practical level, on a very practical basis, to understand, is this individual trustworthy, or is this business trustworthy? Will he pay back his loan, for example? We don't know, but there are things that we can use to sort of support that. But the problem is, more and more people are trusting this bad data to make decisions. And essentially, it stems from many issues, sort of like the anonymity of reviewers on many of these systems, for example, is a big problem. Because you can create fake accounts, you can go in and write bad reviews for a business or whatever. Also, there's this issue with humans, right? In that, because I've engaged you in an economic sort of context, I've essentially gone into a contract with you saying, okay, I'm willing to pay for an item or service that you're providing, and I receive that item or service, and I'm happy with that, right? But the thing is, I've transacted value, and therefore I believe I received what I expected, and therefore I have zero incentive to go above and beyond, to go and rate and review you, right? Especially the review part. Rating is much easier because it's much simpler. We're faced with, there are ways from a UI perspective to get people to rate, but there are other ways to do it too. But what this means is that we're actually 54% more likely to share our opinion if it's negative than if we've had a good experience. And that means that we have a negative skew in the data. And there are other issues, for example, like these centralized rate and review systems. I won't name them, but they recently have been sued in class action lawsuits because essentially they're incentivized to sell advertising on their platform. And if you have a bad reputation, you're an easy target for them because they can come and say, hey, you've got like 6 reviews here, and you see that really, really negative one that's skewing people's opinion of your business, and that is affecting your bottom line. And so that's a very easy sort of sale tactic. But the thing is that, these businesses, how many times have they been involved in transactions, but only 6 reviews, and let's say that 2 of them, for some reason, had some skew? It could have been sabotage, for example, by a competing business.
So maybe
Yeah.
in Croatia,
Yeah.
not Croatia,
Okay.
there's a big tourist boom,
Yeah.
and there are gangs now that go to restaurants, and
Yeah.
basically it's like protection money, and
Okay.
if they don't pay money, they'll get people in some other countries just to negatively review the restaurants or the business, and it's basically like a scam. And they literally go from like cafe to cafe and say, if you don't give us money, we'll just completely obliterate your ratings.
Yeah, and it will kill your business.
Exactly.
It's just the reality. You will lose your business. In fact, you'll lose up to 80% of business if you have 4 out of 6 reviews that are negative. And it doesn't even have to be like super negative. It still affects your business. So essentially, but there's hope. So there was research that was done out of MIT that essentially establishes that in order to address these issues and these great review systems, we have to provide a system that penalizes sort of the attempt to manipulate this system, but also that rewards or incentivizes positive behavior in the system. Well, it's kind of interesting because there is an application here, something that we developed called Credify. So what we do is, going back to what I was talking about, is this identity concept. So knowing who the counterparty is one thing that we can do to help protect this system. Right? Because if it isn't able to be anonymous, if you can't go in and create 1,000 fake accounts to go and attack or to support a raid of someone, then that's one way. But it's not a perfect way, but it's one way to address this. And then, based upon the individual essentially divulging certain bits of information about themselves, but done so in a very, it's done so in a completely private way. So, in other words, I, for example, say I'm from Japan, I live in Japan, I'm this age, and I have this nationality. Now, there's a way for me, essentially, to have that information validated about who I am and where I live and what I do, without me telling you anything that's personally identifiable. So we're developing a protocol, essentially, that enables this mechanism. So, for example, you upload your passport, it's sent to a service that checks that passport data, verifies it's a valid passport, and then there's a mechanism of that third party attesting to the fact that you are who you say you are, and then none of that data is stored in the system. So it's all ephemeral. So once you've established this base of identity, now there are engagements in this system, like, for example, in this marketplace system, where you as an individual have engaged the vendor, for example, and you have a verified history of engagement with him because it's all recorded through the system in the ledger, and it's immutable. At that point, you can start to vouch for their business. So you can take something of value and you can stake it on the reputation of that business. And as that vendor starts to render their services or selling their products, then if you have good outcomes, I will be rewarded. But if you have bad outcomes, then I'll be penalized. And then there is a reward associated as well for the person who is actually representing the result of the interaction. So what that means is that, there's an incentive for me to represent the interaction. And I've written a white paper for this in this past. It's a huge market opportunity. Essentially, all services that are happening online are depending upon these things when we're talking about, entities engaging through these systems, even offline too. And there are, protocol touch points here. I'm just going to kind of blow through this because I think we're doing pretty long for that. Okay, so here's another mechanism, essentially, that it's essentially the same protocol, but being applied in a different vertical. So in this vertical, it's a microloan system for emerging economies, for example. We have these microloans, these micropayment mechanisms to where essentially, let's say that I have a business, I'm an entrepreneur making curd. I have cows that I essentially derive the milk from, create the curd to go to the market and sell it. Now let's say I want to grow that business. Well, the problem is I don't have any history I don't have any way for you to determine my creditworthiness. So if I were to look for a loan to grow my business, how could you come and say, oh yeah, you're creditworthy? It's very difficult because there's just no history there to represent that, right? Well, there's a way to apply the same mechanism, essentially, to provide a credibility metric for the borrower based upon sort of like a social consensus as to the creditworthiness of that individual. So you can imagine that you have sort of an impoverished community, and there's an entrepreneur amongst them who is very diligent. They're waking up every morning, they're working hard, and everyone in their little group, their little town, they see them on a daily basis working hard, and they know that that's a legitimate business. And due to that, they would be willing to take something of value and stake it on their reputation, stake it on their credibility. And as that individual pays back the loan, then a clip out of the interest gets rewarded to me for backing it. So that's another sort of application of this. And we're actually working on even more involved applications in the FinTech space, like insurance and reinsurance or risk. Yeah.
With the microloans, I mean, I know there's algorithms out there, especially within Africa. A lot of the people are still on the legacy phones.
Yeah.
There's algorithms that would look at how often they're replenishing their minutes. Are they actually charging the phone on a regular basis? When the location devices are they going back to the same space?
Yeah.
Based on that, the algorithm will know are they creditworthy to do these microloans,
Right.
and the default rate is actually 0.1%. It's a very small default rate because they depend on these microloans for their daily business.
Definitely.
So, I mean, in terms of relying on a third or second or third party to validate that, are you working with these systems that are already in place through the telco?
Yes. It's an augmentation of that. Now, again, I kind of list up here. You'll see it. The average global microloan interest rate is 35%.
It's huge.
We need to chip that away, right? If we want to enable societies, these impoverished societies, we need to chip away at that. And if we can have various metrics that we can use to chip away at that, then it would be sort of like taking all of these systems in summation of their creditworthiness. If that makes sense.
I'm not sure if I get that right.
Yeah.
So instead of only having a history of repaying loans and taking loans, also the community can get a piece, like real money,
Yes.
by just voting for
Yes. That's right.
Wouldn't that be pumping up the interest rate though? So
No,
To a
because
certain
what
extent.
happens is, as the society, or so the way it works is that the individuals that are backing that borrower, they're essentially de-risking the loan. Because what happens is, if that borrower defaults, then the amount that they've staked on that loan gets remitted to the lender as a form of recourse. Right?
So, is it like, for instance, from LinkedIn,
Uh-huh.
if I endorse someone's skill,
Yeah. It's something like that, but the problem with like this kind of system is that, you could say that there is a reputational risk for me to back your skill, right? For me to vouch for your skill. So there is something at risk there. So that does sort of meet that criteria to some degree. So in essence, it is similar. Because you're taking something of value and you're putting it at risk to represent the credibility of the individual that you're backing, essentially. And then just kind of, we're done. And I'm sorry for taking so long. It's been long. Any questions?